The Free Speech Podcast is an initiative of SFLC.in under the Free Speech Project to understand the changing landscape of free speech in an internet enabled world. We have spoken to a host of journalists, activists, lawyers, and scholars to understand and rethink our current landscape around free speech in India.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Free Speech Podcast. Today we have Prabir Purkayastha with us. Prabir is an engineer and a science activist in power, telecom, and software sector. He was also one of the founding members of the Delhi Science Forum and is the president of the Free Software Movement. At SFLC, we work closely with the free software movement, so it's always a delight to host Prabir. Prabir has also founded Newsclick, an online news platform that we all refer to for a lot of our news. He has written and published extensively on a variety of science and technology policy issues in several leading journals and newspapers, including EPW, Times of India. He's also written two books titled Uncle Sam's Nuclear Cabin and Embryon Blowout, Corporate Capitalism and the Theft of Global Concerns. Welcome, Prabir. We're very happy to have you today with us. To continue, the first question that I would like to ask you, Prabir, is that, in the last couple of years, we've seen a major crackdown on free speech. We have had a number of protests. I mean, recently the farmers' protest was very successful in terms of the they got what they wanted. But in general, when we see any protest or social movement which is against government policies or even against the prevailing narrative, it's met with a severe clampdown. Then there is harassment and there is trolling. There have been several internet shutdowns imposed during CA protests and farmers' protest. Stories of exploitation of journalists getting arrested. They facing various kinds of state brutalities are also have come forward. What role do you think that journalists and civil societies have in this current environment to play again, to have in building resilience during such times?
The question is the public space is always going to be important for the people. And it is important for the people if we don't raise our voices in different ways, whether it's in the media or outside, then we are also giving or we are, delivering our future to the hands of the few who run the state. So that is always going to be a risk for the future of any country. That if we are not able to speak up either as citizens or as the media, and it's not just the media today particularly, there are so many other ways of speaking up, then of course we are handing over our future, the future of the country, to a small section of the people who are in control of the state. So in that sense, I think the ability to speak up, to articulate what we feel, what we want, and particularly for movements who have been fighting for the rights of different sections of the people, I think it's very important that we are able to raise our voices and reach our voices to the people. I think that's where the media comes in, because it acts as a bridge between people who protest, people who articulate views, even the government who articulates its views. It's the task of the media to reach all these voices to a larger audience. And I think that is vital for the future of a country and, of course, for democracy.
Right. When we speak about a lot of these protests that are going on, and there is a category of speech that causes a lot of public unrest. We saw that very recently. What is the balance that we should be looking at between free speech and punishing those who use free speech to cause public unrest?
There have been two opinions regarding free speech. I will say the libertarian one, which the American supposedly are the closest to, supposedly, because it really doesn't work like that in practice, as you know with the case of Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning. So the question there is that all speech is regarded as free, and unless it causes, you're really causing material harm, your activities with respect to speech is there should not be regulated is one, as I said, a very libertarian or interpretation of free speech. The other is that there has to be some restrictions. For instance, arguing for genocide, inciting violence, inciting, views which can lead to demeaning of women. For instance, we had the case recently of this bully, buy, and sully deals. These are not free speech. They are, in fact, the classic argument that if your free speech is going to hurt me, then of course I have to also be protected. So what is it? Your freedom stops where my nose ends. So, those kind of issues are very much there. So I'm not a believer in libertarian construct of free speech. But at the same time, I also recognize that if we allow the state to regulate speech, then what are the checks and balances we have? And there it's really the construction of the law, how the law is actually made and how it is interpreted. Unfortunately, in India, this issue has not been that the free speech is the issue, but you have also these various other laws which are what is treason. Now, that should have gone with the colonial administration. It didn't. In fact, both the governments and the courts held on to this issue of treason, and that has always been something that can be used. Then you have all kinds of other laws which have been put in place. And there are also insidious laws which are not directly about free speech, but regulate, for instance, media entities in different ways. And they can then, of course, be used to also control the media. So, it becomes a more complex scenario when you go into the details of how free speech is to be regulated or not. But I don't think we can accept that, people have the right to free speech and propagate genocide, for instance, which is what the issue has become also now, as we have seen in the Hardwar speeches and a couple of other places speeches, and also the kind of incitement to violence that you see on social media continuously.
Correct. Like how earlier we used to have public squares where people would come together and discuss the matters of importance. I think votes used to be decided in those squares. Those squares have now become social media and they're much, much bigger. Their reach is much wider. Uh, and with the recent revelations which have come out from the Wires report and Tech Fog, they show how susceptible it is to use social media platforms. Social media platforms are inherently structured in a manner so that they catch more eyeballs. User engagement is the main driving force. And as we know that hate gets more likes and more shares than anything else. And this has real world implications. We've seen it in case of Rohingya crisis in Myanmar and the Delhi riots. However, government regulation is often excessive, causing a chilling effect. We've seen this with the new rules, which is coming down heavily on traceability on independent news publishers. How do you think social media platforms can act more responsibly, and what proportionate measures can be adopted by the policymakers? Do we really have a solution in place, or we're just all trying to figure out?
You raised a basket of cases, a bare basket of issues, not one. The question is, what is the characteristic of social media itself, as opposed to, for instance, the public squares and the private discussion we used to have. In fact, social media is, in some sense, has the characteristic as if you're in a private space, but it is really a public space, the space that you're in. It doesn't have the characteristic of a public space because you're not in it together. And therefore, you don't really interact with each other. When you're interacting, you're really interacting with you and your screen. So, those are the kind of problems that social media creates. It is a new media, unlike, for instance, the print media, which was old, which, of course, was also what I will call broadcast informed. People who owned the printing press communicated to the many. And you had, for instance, the television medium, which is also a broadcast media, radio. All of them are broadcast media. With the social media, you have one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, all these possibilities. But these possibilities, which we thought initially are something which will be spaces we would control, are no longer so. They are being controlled by essentially just a few platforms. And those platforms, unfortunately, set the rules. I'm coming to the government much later, set the rules for how the social media the messaging spreads, what is propagated, what is not propagated. And it is very clear the algorithms are not geared for a purpose of, say, spreading good quality news. They are basically meant to create engagement. As you said, that engagement is what drives social media. But that is not by design, and that is not by its nature. It's by design, because you have created algorithms so that you will get more likes, you get more shares, you retain people's attention. And if you can retain people's attention, you can sell them to the advertisers. So it's the social media, in Facebook particularly, and Google as well, that you are interested in eyeballs, retention of the eyeballs, because your game is not, the message that people are writing or the videos they are playing. Your essentially interest is to keep the people who are on social media on your platform, so you can sell those people to your advertisers. So it's really the game of selling us to advertisers, which demands then you maximize attention. And maximization of attention, as you said, is basically with fake news, with hate news, something which really gets people much more worked up, and then there's much more they stick much more than to the platform they're on. So this whole issue is really, how do you, in this particular case of social media, how do you regulate social media for the good of the people, of the users? And that really has this problem of what protection do the algorithms get? Because as you know, since SFLC is very much a part of the space, you know that most uh, social media platforms get a relaxation from the government. In almost all countries, they get what is called safe harbor. Safe harbor because you're not promoting a particular point of view, you're not editing it, you're letting people use you as a publishing platform. But what about the algorithms? Because they, in effect, are the ones which drive who sees what. And if that is so, you're not editing them, but very much controlling the narrative on your platforms. And as we know, that it is not as innocent as it appears, that just the algorithms play. Algorithms are tweaked. Algorithms are tweaked because certain powerful forces in countries want it. And they are tweaked to protect people who are otherwise violating the speech rules of the platform, because they're the parties in power, the people in power, they need to be protected for propagating their, what I would say, quite often toxic views. So we have seen this, for instance, in the Delhi riots. People who were propagating riots were very much on the platform in spite of internal Facebook people saying, look, we should get these people off our platform. So I think this is one part of it. How do you regulate the social media platforms? And the real focus has to be, should we break up this platform? Should we have such large monopolies? Should we let Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram all be one conglomerate, and therefore control the social media narrative in countries like India, where the primary access is really through phones? So what do we do with conglomerates like this? I think is a question of monopoly. You raise the issue of the state. How does state regulate? Now, there, the question that is there is, if the state regulates something, for me, for instance, I'm a user of Facebook, say, then I should be able to appeal not to something which is very opaque, which what says Facebook appeals end up in, unless you are from the United States and United Kingdom or in European Union, where your voice might actually make it to the mainstream media and there cause problems for Facebook. So they, as we know, the complaints from other countries really don't get heard in Facebook. Even if you complain, nobody will really attend to it. But when government does something, I should be able to protect myself by using the instrument of at least judiciary. So, what is the judicial review that I can have against the government? That I think is the issue that is there. There's a huge amount of work that has already been done. That if you want to provide protection, uh, or you want to constrain quote unquote speech in social media, how do you do it? Who sets the filters and what is government's role? The question is, you can approach it from the point of view of regulation and say, now Facebook has to actually play the role of a censor. Now, that is going to then be incompatible with saying you are providing them with safe harbor, because then you are playing an editing function. So I think this is the complicated part, that the government and social media platforms, that we need to, this particular interaction, how do you play on it? But my submission would be, this has to be a hands off regulation being done by an independent body, and it should be possible for us to go to judicial authorities in case we have a problem with either the platform or what the government is saying. But on the other side, when you look at the social media platforms, it's clear that Google and Facebook today combined has 80% of the advertising revenue on digital platforms. And it's already, I think, more than 50% of the total ad revenues in the world. Digital platforms get 50% of the ad revenues of the world. Given that, I think the time has come to seriously look at monopolies, particularly Facebook and Google, and the violations of monopoly, the power that they have over both the producers and the viewers.
Right, right. My next question to you would be, the new intermediary guidelines came and they want online news media to be regulated. Yesterday, I think I read it in the newspaper that a sitting minister said that anti-national content is going to be taken off YouTube. Uh, However, do you believe that self-regulation is the solution? If the IT rules of 2021, they have are they close to an ideal module of self-regulation, or is it just over-regulation that we're looking at to curb speech?
Well, between self regulation and the government regulation, the government declaring what is anti national and has to be taken off, then basically they may as well not have any independent platforms whatsoever. And it's essentially making the functioning of independent platforms near impossible, because government's definition of what is, anti-national seems to be so one-sided that any criticism of the government itself now appears to be talked about as anti-national. And if you, for instance, say that Hindutva and Hinduism are very different things, in fact, Savarkar himself said it, then you would also be charged with being violating the sentiments of the people, because according to those who follow Hindutva, Hindutva is also Hinduism, though they also praise Savarkar and what he talked about about Hindutva. So I think what we are talking about is that if you give as weak a handle, characteristic of anti-national, which can mean anything and everything, I think that's almost like saying the government shall decide what should be published, what is not. In which case, you may as well say we don't have any free media. We actually have a completely docile and a media that has to listen to everything the government tells it. Self-regulation makes sense if you make the rules for self-regulation such that there is a certain amount of sanctity to them, that there's an independent body which decides the regulatory activities of the platforms. For instance, in media terms, we run something called DigiPub. We have set up for self-regulatory purposes. We have asked people who have a certain stature in various walks of life, as well ex-Supreme Court retired Chief Justice, to be on the self-regulatory panel. And if any complaint comes, then it goes to them. We have internal mechanisms by which anybody who disagrees with us gets a reply. If not satisfied, then go to the regulatory body, which is self-regulatory in the sense that we have set it up. Now, does that work? It's supposed to be working for broadcasting for quite some time. You have the print media, which has very light regulation using what is, whatever instruments that exist. They're really not, they really don't have teeth, but the print media does exist and it does seem to be working quite well for now, 50, 60, 70 years, except for the small period of emergency when there was actual censorship. So I think, yes, I would say self-censorship is not the issue, but a self-regulation by which the platforms who are in different spaces set up regulatory bodies, even though it's not set up by the state, but set up by the platforms themselves, I think is a viable proposition, as viable a proposition as whatever we had in print media for a very long time. And if that has worked, I don't see why it shouldn't work here as well.
Right. I think that's very insightful. I do think that a lot of people outside the newsrooms don't really know that there is something called self-regulation, internal regulation, and a complaint mechanism that's happening. I mean, for as a matter of fact, I did not know that there is something like that. So maybe a little more public awareness about that can be very helpful. But will be my last question to you, which we're asking all of our panelists, and you've already answered in a way, is that do you think that free speech should be absolute, like the First Amendment, or do we need reasonable restrictions?
Well, as you know, the Europeans, after going through Nazi Germany, fascism, decided that they could not give complete, uh, abdication of the role of the state in regulating speech. So therefore, if you, for instance, say genocide is okay, you would still be charged with various violations of law in most European countries. The United States is an exception because there it has said the free speech is quote unquote near absolute. It never is really, but it claims it is. So I think I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the American model, if that is to be called the model, as I said, it really does not exist in practice, and I'll tell you why. That really won't work. You need to essentially provide for models where free speech is regulated, that it cannot be outright hate speech, calls for genocide, violence, murder, and so on. So the recent Hardwar calls in the Dharma Sansads, which were done, which essentially made this kind of calls, and they have been repeated elsewhere also. Those are calls which should not be allowed to be protected under free speech. So I'm not a believer in untrammeled rights of free speech. Nevertheless, if free speech has certain controls, it certainly should not be the way it is done today. That if anybody can say comments about Adityanath's government regarding COVID handling, as happened during the Delta wave, they were threatened with all kinds of criminal offenses. So that is where you have to see where the balance lies. And effectively, the judiciary has to play a role there. Unfortunately, judiciary has made all the right noises for quite some time. They've been saying excellent things. But when it comes to real protection, have we got it from them? And the answer is no. It seems to drag on for inordinate time. The government seems to get postponements on various issues. And therefore, the people who are under the scanner of the government, they have to literally prove their innocence before the court, not that the court sees, but the government is showing that they are guilty. And this is across a large spectrum of people who are being charged with sedition to various other violations of law. I'm not talking about the misuse of government powers, which is not supposedly for violation of free speech, but for other reasons. But we know where it is coming from. When you have major newspapers, major news organizations in UP and Gujarat, for instance, who brought out the COVID deaths. They were proceeded by income tax department, not the censor board, so to say. Of course, we don't really have a formal censor board, but I mean the various instruments that the government uses, which is sedition to 153A, and etc., etc. So I think my position would be that yes, free speech needs protection, but not hate speech and not propagation of genocide. That has to be considered as not acceptable under law.
Thank you, Prabir, for your amazing insights. I think I personally had a lot to learn. But we're hoping to have more conversations like these in the future to reimagine our laws. I think one of the points of having this podcast is to, rethink where we are and where we're headed. Thank you so much for your time, and we really look forward to having you with us in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and listening to me.